Hey guys, so this video is part 2 on how to paint a landscape from a photograph. Here we'll finish this painting that I started in the previous video. Last time we worked on the top left section of this painting, but here we'll finish what we started and complete the rest of this painting. In case you missed the first video, I left a link for it in the description, as well as links to other videos that go more into depth on how to paint the specific parts of a landscape. So anyways, let's get started. Let's take a look at this river. You have all sorts of colors and textures all over, so how do you even begin to paint all this? First off, we have the bright colors of the tiny water ripples and reflections, and then we have the actual colors of the river, which range from olive green to an aquamarine color. What you want to do first is to paint the colors that are underneath the water ripples and reflections, the base colors of the river. Along with that, I'm continuing blocking in the shapes and colors of this area, putting everything in place. I'm just adding the overall average colors that are in the photo. At this stage, try not to focus on all the details just yet. That would be too overwhelming. Take a general consensus of what is around here and get a main idea of what the main shapes and colors look like. This way these will be the guideposts when we get in closer and start to work on the details. Okay, now let's start to work on this rock. The rocks here will be different than the ones above because they will be more exposed to the water, so they will have a mossy layer on top. I'll be using an olive green color here. As I apply this color, I gently blend the edges of it with the surrounding color. I'm also working on making sure the rock is the right shape. This rock will be partially submerged, and so later on I will add the water ripples and reflections on top of it. So now I start to add more color variety to the water. You're going to have lots of varying shades of color, and we'll be painting many small patches of color all over the place. I'm using a very desaturated aquamarine color here right now. I'm adding these chunks of color in this area here in an arbitrary way. Now I add some white paint here. This edge here by this black line will be the brightest, but then as it goes down I will add a small amount of blue and green to help start this color transition. I'm painting these same type of brush strokes here, random and spontaneous. The way you see me paint here will be pretty much the same way I'll be covering up many other areas of the water. What we are really doing is working from big to small. Notice how these brush strokes are smaller than the ones I had painted earlier when I established the main base colors everywhere. I'm going further into each small area of the painting and honing in the colors and values as I keep refining the area. I'm setting the stage for later on when I use the smallest brush and work on the tiniest detail. I then spent some time refining the surrounding area, blocking in more color and value. Notice how I'm painting over some areas, since this is going to involve using layering. Also remember, what we are painting is all the rocks and ground that are underneath the water surface. As I'm painting these clusters of varying color and value, I'm paying attention to the reference photo to make sure I place them in the right areas. Even though my brushing itself looks random and fast, I'm very deliberate with where I place these colors and values. You can see I'm switching my mixture a lot here, from olive green to aquamarine to black in some areas, and some values in between. As you're painting this, make sure that you add color variety and texture to any solid color that you see. So you can start to see as I continue adding these patches of colors, my brushing is generally getting smaller and smaller. What I see many new artists do is that they usually stop painting somewhere in this stage of the painting, where they never end up going deeper and getting to the smallest of detail. Remember, we're working from big to small. Make sure that you cover your bases with getting these smudges of color everywhere, so that next we can start to work on the textures and details of these underwater rocks, and likewise with everything else we paint from this point forward. Paying attention to detail like this is important, as all the small things are going to add up. Okay, so now I go here and add some more refined textures on this rocky surface. I'm switching to my fine detailer brush with a much brighter mix of olive green and start to add these tiny spots of paint on the surface. I'm painting these in such a way where I blend some of them, but I also leave some of them alone so they can stay sharp and defined. Depending on what you paint, you will use a certain degree of blending. Now let's paint the water ripples. I'm getting a mixture of white with a small amount of blue and starting to paint these water ripples. As I'm painting these, you'll notice how I leave some of them alone and not blend them. But some of them I'm blending either together or with the surrounding colors already established. Make sure not to create any patterns, because the more random and spontaneous your painting is, the more organic and realistic it's going to look. Also, in some of these spots, I'm adding an extra amount of blue color because some of them are going to be darker than others. Now I return here to elaborate even further on the water. I'm doing the same thing here, adding these patches of color on this water surface. This area won't have as much contrast, but it still has quite a bit of textures of varying colors. This part I'm making here, if you can't already tell, is an indentation in the river where some water will be pouring down. I'm creating a transition of value here, giving it a rounded out shape. So now I get my fine detailer brush and add the smallest detail. I get a mixture of white with a very small amount of blue and green and start to add these tiny clusters of paint. What I'm doing is smoothing out this area where this black line meets the white area. This color mixture is pretty universal here, as I'm using the same one for multiple purposes. One is for painting the tiny splashes of water, as you can see that I'm doing here. The second purpose is for painting the very small textures inside the white areas. I then switch to a pure white mixture and add the topmost part of this water layer. I add these very small smudges of paint and I partially blend them amongst each other as well as with the background. Now let's work on the actual waterfall here. I'm painting these tiny vertical lines here in the various sizes. I'm also alternating my value mixture here as well, where some are lighter than the other ones. Also, don't always use a fresh wet mixture. Use some of that leftover dry paint to blend the edges of these lines that you're painting, as well as create some smaller, less visible water droplets. I'm also painting the reflections of the sky on the edge of this waterfall. The way you can tell the difference between those and the light water splashes is that the sky reflections are a light blue, but the water splashes are aquamarine. I'm painting more of these reflections in some areas here now, just like I did earlier on the right side. You can start to see how all this texturing and layering is coming together to create this body of water. Now I come back and work on the textures here. Don't rush this process, because if you do, it will take away from the quality of the painting at the end. Once again, don't let any area here look too solid or monotone. Add lots of textures here because this area has lots of splashing and water rippling in many random ways. Much of the painting technique I'm doing here is really the same throughout the entire painting. Just lots of texturing to varying degrees, some layering, and some blending. Much of the work is just repetition. Try to avoid making these smudges look too stiff or rigid. Make them well integrated into the painting by partially blending them. And if you do find yourself overpainting something, not a problem. Just go back and forth between the mixtures to build up a solid stack of layers. This can especially happen with the brightest white parts, as it's easy to get carried away trying to paint the highlights. Let's take a break from this section and work on some other things. So last time we didn't do a whole lot here, but now let's return and get some things going. I want to continue adding the foundations for the texture here, which will be a rugged terrain with a whole bunch of objects like rocks, twigs, and leaves. This ground has lots of different shades of brown, yellow, olive green, and hints of orange. So what is the best way to approximate this color scheme to our painting? I'm going to start painting each color and value onto the texture and just continually keep adding and layering various other hues. Remember that when you have doubt about painting something, squint your eyes at the reference photo and see what main colors and values that you could add up. Once again, I'm working from big to small. This is going to be very similar to how we painted the water. I'm adding all these smudges of color and then I'm blending them together. Be careful not to overblend, however, as we do want to preserve these textures we worked so hard to make. I take a break from that and return to working on the rock. As you can see, I'm painting these basic chunks of color on here in varying degrees of value. I'm setting the stage of where the transitions are going to be from light to dark. Not only do I have to paint the basic rock formation here, but I'm also having to paint all the moss covering up this rock. This should actually be easy this time because the entire rock is covered in it, so we could just use the various shades of green to take care of this from the get-go. These initial colors are smoothly applied, but now I'll add some more rougher textures on here with this black color. As you're watching this video, you probably noticed that my style of brushing is really not that different everywhere I paint. I first apply the smooth brushing, then add large rough patches, then I do the same except smaller, do some blending, and go even smaller. And that's exactly what I'm starting to do now. I'm painting these small dark textures on here, which next I'll be partially layering over. What you don't want to do is paint them too perfectly. Make them kind of smudgy, because they will be the shadows amongst the moss covering up the surface area. However, when I go over a brighter area, I switch up this mixture away from black to a desaturated green color because I want it to stay proportionate to where I'm painting. I don't want to paint too dark of shadows on an area where it's really bright. So I take a break from painting these dark spots and switch to some bright mixtures. I'm now applying the bright textures on here. What I want to convey to you is that the order of doing this is not that important. You could go back and forth between dark and light until you sculpt the rock and its textures to your own liking. What you want to do is cover up the entire surface of this rock with these textures, so continue stacking these colors and values on top of each other. I think I've shown you enough here for now. Let's work again on the ground. So I come back here to add some more patches of brown color. After I apply these, I then blend them along with the rest of the background. I also share the same color as I continue adding more of it to the overall area here, adding more diversity of hues across this ground area. I then do the same thing with this color. The more diversity you have of color here, the better. Painting textures on the ground like this involves a simple task of working from big to small and doing some blending here and there. So once I have a decent amount of texture, I want to get some small rocks in here. I have established a decent baseline of texture on the ground, and so now I feel comfortable enough to paint some objects here. But here I don't want to leave yet afterwards because I still want to come back and elaborate more on this ground. I just don't want to waste time painting something that I'll be covering up later on, and so it's important to strike a balance between painting something in the beginning, then adding objects to it, and then finally adding more detail around these objects. So after I spent some time taking care of these small rocks, I then go back to add the smallest detail on the textures in the ground. I'm going to be using a generally light brown mixture for this, but I will alternate this mixture with varying degrees of color and value. This texture I'm painting is a combination of small rocks embedded inside the ground as well as many bumps and indentations on here, so using this variety of color and blending will help paint this. I'm connecting some of them together here, but really what I'm trying to do is create the illusion that there's lots of different things going on down here. Once I have enough of that, I work on some leaves on the ground. So painting these leaves will be just like everything else I've been painting so far. Paint the basic shapes, add some texture, and then add highlights. What you don't want to do is paint them in that traditional leaf shape that we all know about. These are fallen leaves that are crumpled up in all sorts of random shapes. The leaf colors are going to be green and orange, and both will be desaturated, so pay attention to that. Now for the final part down here, we still need to add some miscellaneous branches and twigs laying around. I'm using a fresh wet mixture to lay out this light brown base color. These branches will be very thin, so be careful to how thick your line will be. Then I add some very small darker parts to them to add some shape and texture. So overall, this is how I paint the ground of a forested area. Even though I covered a small section of the total ground area, following this formula will be the same for other places. Of course, some spots will have different degrees of texture and objects, so adjust your brush and mixture accordingly. Now I'm going to finish this bottom part of the painting. Everything I'm doing now is nothing new, no groundbreaking techniques to show you, just lots of texturing and blending. At this point of the painting, we've gotten over the hump where we had to match the main objects to the reference photo. Once you have the main objects established, it gets easier in my opinion because that's where there's less stress about placing the objects in the right areas. However, this part is the most time consuming though because you're doing a lot of repetitive work with adding the fine details. It's really easy to stop short at this stage and do a mediocre job with detailing, but paying attention to all the small things add up in the end. So here we are now, going back to this complex group of trees and vegetation. How on earth are we going to put this together? There's so many layers and things here that are covered up by the next layers after that. Just like with everything else we have done, we work from the back to the front. When it comes to stacking the layers here, we do exactly that. I've already started some of this in the previous video, but here we're going to finish it. What I'm first going to do is paint some solid light colors in a few places. These colors won't be that solid for that much longer until we start painting more trees, branches, and leaves covering up some of that. The thing about this section is that there's a lot of sunlit spots inside the forested area, so we are painting dark over light instead of the other way around. There's also tree trunks of various sizes you have to place inside these leaf clusters as well, which will be partially obscured by these layers. The types of leaves in this section are those long tropical reed types, and so I will be adding a good amount of these in most of the section. So I'm painting over these bright spots with these leaves, and since there's so many layers going on here, you don't really need to worry about where or on what they grow on. Just add them throughout the area. Keep the mixture wet as we want to have very smooth brushing here. Use a dark green mixture because many of these leaves will be darkened by the shadows throughout these clusters of plants. There will be some small trees that stand out in the front as well, so I'm getting those on here. Don't worry about covering them up, because even if you do accidentally paint something over them, you could go back and repaint that same tree trunk over it. I then switch over to a bright green and yellow mixture to add some more light spots. These of course will once again be layered over by some darker parts. Painting this section is different than what we have done on the left side in the previous video, because back then we had a more defined sense of layering and could paint the leaves that stood out at the front a lot easier. However, in this case, there's many jumbled together things going on here, where the leaves at the very front are obscured by the shadow and the highlights inside the groups of vegetation. Then I use a more neutral, basic green mixture and go around more places, filling in any areas that have too much solid color. I layer over the trees that I want to cover up more, and add more color variety to places that need it. And then after that I go to dark again and continue adding these dark leaves. Notice how this area is starting to really take shape. I keep going back and forth with the color values and stack more layers so that we have enough of them to create a good amount of separation between the leaves and trees. I also make sure I finish off any open spaces and fill them up with miscellaneous vegetation. Also, don't forget to add a small amount of light to the tree trunks. I take a break from that and continue working on the small dark area here, adding textures to it similar to the ground below. Here it's going to be darker, so I'll be using darker hues overall. Mostly it's different variations of brown. Don't go overboard with any lighter values here. Make sure to preserve the darkness of the small incline in the ground. Then I go back to the water to finish off most of these areas. I'm going through the painstaking process of very small brushing to add these final textures in these distant parts of the river. Everything I'm doing right now is all the same exact things I demonstrated earlier in the video. I'm closing in on the end of this painting. It's so easy to overlook the final details of your work and finish prematurely. It's easy to do that if you're really excited about showcasing your artwork to the world. Remember the things I said about working from big to small. I'd say that's the number one thing I want to convey in this video. If you can follow that principle, you could get down to the tiniest details here. It's all about how far you want to take this painting. So we have reached the end. Painting this took a lot of time, since this photograph had a huge amount of detail and layering that had to be tediously applied. What made it easier for me, I think, is that the paints I used had a very high viscosity to them, so that my brushing was very smooth and applying the tiny brushing was made much easier. And by the way, they're called golden acrylics, so I highly recommend them. I hope that watching this two-part series was helpful, and that seeing the way I paint can supplement your strategy with painting. And this is just one way of painting amongst many other approaches. If you did find this helpful in any way, hit the like button on the way out and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you.